The crimson liquid spreading across the pristine linoleum of the West Wing didn't come from a surgical mishap. The woman looking down at the fallen gunman, gripping a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears with the white-knuckled precision of a professional reaper, certainly wasn't a victim. For years, the hospital staff saw Sable Morrison as a non-entity. The nurse who prepped the meal trays, lived for her boring anniversary, and bowed her head to every arrogant resident. They saw a woman who was invisible. They were wrong. When John Hollis locked down the trauma ward, he thought he was the wolf in the fold. He didn't know he had just trapped himself with the only person the dragon of the CO syndicate answers to. This is the night the world's most dangerous assassins realize that the most lethal place on Earth isn't a dark alley. It's the night shift of a woman with a hidden past and nothing left to lose. I tell real stories like this every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now here's what really happened. The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan Central's 4th floor flickered with a rhythmic, sickly hum that echoed the monotony of Sable Morrison's life. To the daytime staff, she was a ghost in oversized blue scrubs, a woman who walked with a soft, practiced shuffle designed to make her disappear into the very paint of the walls. She was 36, but the severe, functional bun she wore made her look like a woman who had already surrendered to time. Sable moved through the ghost hours of the graveyard shift with a quiet, reliable efficiency that her colleagues mistook for lack of ambition. At the nurses' station, the air was a thick cocktail of industrial bleach and ozone. A young intern leaned against a medication cart, scrolling through his phone and barely glancing up as Sable replaced a stack of patient files with a soft, "Excuse me." "She's a total NPC, I swear," he whispered to a colleague, loud enough for Sable to hear. He had asked her about her anniversary plans earlier, and her answer, meal prep, had become the joke of the break room. To them, she was a robot, a non-entity so boring it was difficult to imagine her having a pulse, let alone a husband. Dr. Eris, the senior trauma lead, was the worst of the architects of her invisibility. He was a man far too arrogant to notice the people he deemed beneath him. When he barked orders for new charts without looking up from his clipboard, he didn't see a woman. He saw a pair of hands to carry out his commands. "Keep her away from the VIP in 412, Eris muttered, his voice echoing off the sterile tiles. "She doesn't have the personality to handle high-profile families." Sable merely bowed her head in a mask of perfect submission, her voice a soft whisper as she replied, "Right away, doctor." But beneath the loose fabric of her uniform, Sable's skin hummed with a different frequency. While she appeared to be staring blankly at a vitals monitor, her dark, calculating eyes were actually timing the rotation of the security guards downstairs. She was a century waiting for a war. Hidden by her collar, the jagged, faded scar tissue on the back of her neck remained a silent testament to her loyalty to the CO syndicate, a mark of the predator she was forced to hide. She allowed them to see a woman who was weak and timid because it was the only way to keep her world from bleeding into theirs. She was the master of her own cage, waiting for the moment the wolves would finally kick down the door. The surgical silence of the West Wing didn't just break, it shattered. It began with the sharp, rhythmic clackslide of a bolt carrier group being sent home, a mechanical snarl that had no place in a house of healing. Sable Morrison's spine straightened instantly, the timid nurse receding as her internal clock shifted into tactical frames. She didn't turn her head. Instead, she watched the reflection in the glass of a medicine cabinet as the service elevators chimed. 2 men in dark jackets stepped out, their gait heavy and purposeful, marked by the measured stride of men carrying weight rather than the frantic shuffle of worried relatives. 2 targets, she whispered to herself, her voice a perfect mask of submission even as her mind deconstructed the threat. Concealed items, high-tension posture. Before the intern could finish another sentence about the boredom of the night shift, the double doors at the end of the corridor burst open. John Hollis stormed in, a dark silhouette framed by the flickering fluorescent lights. He wasn't a desperate man, he was a precision instrument of rage, his assault rifle leveled with terrifying intent. "Nobody moves. Hands where I can see them." His voice boomed like a thunderclap, instantly turning the sterile ward into a tomb. Dr. Eris froze, his clipboard clattering to the floor as his face drained of all color, while the young intern let out a stifled sob, his phone slipping from his trembling fingers. To the gunman, the staff looked like sheep waiting for the blade. They saw the nurse standing by the medication cart and saw a non-entity, a weak link to be exploited. They didn't notice that Sable didn't scream or flinch. as Hollis swung the muzzle of his rifle toward the station. His eyes manic and searching for resistance, he found none in her. Instead, Sable executed a perfect tactical deception. She let her knees tremble and her shoulders hunch, her hands flying to her face in a display of absolute, manufactured vulnerability. "Please," she whimpered, her voice cracking with a terror that reached her very fingertips. "I'm just a nurse. Don't hurt us." Hollis sneered, the sight of her weakness feeding his ego as he beckoned her forward with a jerk of his weapon. Sable stumbled toward him, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, a calculated act that allowed her to drop her eye line and scan his belt. In that split second, she noted the brand of his sidearm, the detonator clipped to his vest, and the safety on his rifle. The wolves had entered the fold, but they had no idea they had just barricaded themselves in with the most dangerous predator in the building. The heavy silence of the supply closet was broken only by the ragged, terrified breathing of 7-year-old Leo, who huddled behind a stack of sterile linens. Sable stood between the boy and the door, her shoulders still hunched, her head bowed in the practiced posture of a victim. Outside, the rhythmic thud of combat boots against the linoleum grew louder until the door was kicked inward with a violent crash. A gunman stepped into the small space, his rifle leading the way. He saw nothing but a trembling nurse and a child, easy targets, loose ends to be tied. He sneered, the metal of his weapon glinting under the dim emergency light as he raised the muzzle toward the boy. "Please," Sable whimpered, her voice cracking with the manufactured terror that had kept her secret safe for years. "He's just a child. Don't do this." The gunman didn't hesitate. His finger began to tighten on the trigger. In that quarter second of lethal intent, the mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. Sable didn't retreat. She exploded forward with a predatory grace that defied the gravity of her scrubs. Her left hand lashed out like a cobra, seizing the barrel of the rifle and shoving it toward the ceiling just as the muzzle flashed. The deafening roar of the shot was swallowed by the sound of shifting metal. Before the man could register the change in power, Sable's right hand whipped a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears from her pocket. She didn't use them to cut fabric. With surgical precision and the cold, unblinking eyes of a seasoned killer, she drove the steel blades into the gap of his tactical vest, finding the soft tissue of the throat with terrifying accuracy. The gunman's eyes widened, his muffled roar of pain cut short as his life began to pool on the sterile tiles. Sable didn't flinch. Her heart rate remained stable, her mind already mapping the next tactical frame. She caught his collapsing frame, lowering him silently to the floor to avoid alerting the others. As she stood back up, the timid Nurse Vance was gone. The light in her eyes was now as cold as a Siberian winter, reflecting a power that had been suppressed for too long. She looked down at her blood-stained hands, then at the trembling boy behind her. "Don't look back, Leo," she commanded, her voice now a chilling level anchor in the storm. "Just hold on to me. We're going to fly." The ghost in blue had finally returned to the world of the living, and the wolves in the hallway had no idea that their hunter had just been reborn. Sable stepped out of the supply closet, leaving the darkness behind but carrying its chill in her marrow. She didn't walk like the invisible nurse anymore. She moved with the predatory economy of a shadow, her weight distributed perfectly to silence the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, had been transformed into a tactical grid. To the gunman, the 4 poles, oxygen tanks, and surgical trays were background noise. To Sable, they were an arsenal. She reached the darkened corridor leading to the main nurses' station, where 2 of Hollis's men stood guard. They were relaxed, their rifles slung low, confident in their total dominion over the docile staff. Sable reached into her utility belt, her fingers bypassing the Band-Aids and alcohol wipes to find a 50 cubic centimeter syringe preloaded with a potent anesthetic. Beside it, she gripped a heavy, stainless steel reflex hammer, a tool designed to test nerves, now repurposed to shatter them. She moved through the shadows of the charting alcoves, her breathing so shallow it wouldn't have stirred a candle flame. The first guard never heard her approach. She emerged from the gloom behind him, her left hand clamping over his mouth while her right drove the reflex hammer into the base of his skull with a sickening, muffled thud. As he went limp, she caught his frame, lowering him with the practiced care she used for frail patients, ensuring his gear didn't clatter against the floor. The second guard turned, alerted by a phantom sound, but Sable was already a blur of blue fabric and cold intent. Before he could raise his weapon, she closed the distance, the long needle of the syringe finding the exposed vein in his neck with surgical accuracy. She plunged into the sedative home. His eyes went wide, his nervous system short-circuiting as the chemical hammer dropped him into a forced coma. She stripped the radio from his vest, clicking it once to listen to the frantic chatter of Hollis's team. They were hunting a ghost, blinded by their own arrogance. Sable looked down at the reflex hammer in her hand, the steel catching a stray glint of emergency light. She wasn't just defending a ward, she was deconstructing an invasion. Every corner of the hospital was now a trap, every medical tool a lethal instrument, and as she disappeared back into the darkness of the West Wing, it became clear that the night shift had only just begun. In the heart of the city, miles away from the antiseptic halls of the hospital, C.O. Muntaque sat in the back of a black sedan that felt like a vault. The rain hammered against the reinforced roof, a frantic percussion that matched the sudden, sharp vibration of the burner phone in his pocket. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what it was. It was a silent distress signal, a digital heartbeat that had been dormant for 3 years. Muntaque's face remained a mask of polished flint as he read the alert. Lockdown. West Wing. To anyone else, it was a call for help. To the man known as the Iron Dragon, it was a notification of a shift change. He didn't reach for the radio to contact the authorities, nor did his pulse quicken with the frantic energy of a worried husband. He knew Sable. He knew the woman who had once been the syndicate's most lethal shadow before she chose the quiet life of a nurse. "The ward is hot," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that commanded the air in the car. His driver, a man scarred by a dozen street wars, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Should we call the precinct, boss?" "No," Muntaque replied, his eyes tracing the rain-streaked neon of the city outside. "By the time the police set up a perimeter, my wife will have already finished the surgery. Call the cleanup crews. Tell them to bring heavy-duty lye and unmarked bags. Tell them to prepare for a high volume of medical waste." He leaned back into the shadows of the leather seat, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He thought of the gunmen currently pacing the halls of Metropolitan Central, men who believed they were the predators because they carried rifles and wore tactical vests. They were amateurs playing in a professional's playground. They had entered the hospital looking for a victim, but they had walked into an operating theater where Sable was the lead surgeon. "Sir?" the driver asked, hesitant. "What if she needs backup?" Muntaque looked out at the distant silhouette of the hospital tower, where the fourth-floor lights flickered like a dying star. "She doesn't need backup. She needs a sanitization team. Sable doesn't leave survivors when she's working. She only leaves evidence." He adjusted his cufflinks with clinical, terrifying discipline. "Drive. I want to be there when she's finished. I want to be the first to bow to the woman who reminds the world why the dragon sleeps with one eye open." The lights didn't just go out. They died with a heavy, metallic groan as the main breakers were severed. In an instant, the West Wing was plunged into a suffocating, velvet blackness, broken only by the frantic, strobe-like pulses of red emergency beacons. The hum of the ventilators stuttered, a terrifying silence falling over the ward that signaled a 6-minute countdown. Without power, the backup oxygen manifolds would soon lock, and the patients, the silent, vulnerable souls Sable had sworn to protect, would begin to suffocate in the dark. John Hollis's voice crackled over the stolen radio, dripping with a sadistic calm. "Welcome to the dark, little nurse. Let's see how well you heal when you can't see the wounds." Sable didn't panic. Her pupils dilated, her vision adjusting to the crimson rhythm of the emergency lights. To her, the darkness wasn't a shroud, it was a cloak. She moved through the corridors with the haptic memory of a woman who knew every tile, every doorway, and every blind spot. While Hollis's men fumbled for tactical lights, their beams cutting through the gloom like clumsy swords, Sable became a part of the shadows. She reached the first patient's room, her hands moving with lightning speed. She wasn't using a flashlight. She felt for the manual override valves, her fingers identifying the shapes of the regulators by touch alone. She cracked the emergency flow, the hiss of life-saving air returning to the room. But as she turned to leave, a shadow loomed in the doorway, a gunman, his laser sight dancing across the wall in search of a target. Sable didn't retreat. She dropped to a crouch, her silhouette disappearing behind a heavy dialysis machine. As the gunman stepped into the room, his breath hitched in the silence. He was hunting a ghost, but he was the one being haunted. Sable reached out, not with a weapon, but with a simple heavy-duty blood pressure cuff. As he passed her position, she swung the weighted Velcro strap with the force of a mace, catching him across the temple. Before he could cry out, she was on him, her hand sealing his mouth while she used a length of plastic tubing to bind his throat with a clinical, terrifying knot. She checked her watch. 4 minutes left. The air in the ward felt heavy, the smell of ozone thickening as the backup batteries groaned under the strain. Hollis was somewhere near the main oxygen tank, intending to turn the hospital's lifeblood into a bomb. Sable stood up, the red light washing over her blood-flecked scrubs, making her look like a vengeful spirit born from the hospital's own walls. She didn't need light to find him. She could smell his fear, and in the dark, she was the only one who knew the way out. The emergency strobes painted the trauma ward in a rhythmic, bloody pulse as Sable Morrison stepped into the main corridor. At the far end, silhouetted by the flickering light of a dying monitor, stood John Hollis. He had discarded his tactical vest, his breathing ragged, his unrefined rage manifesting as a desperate, feral energy. In his hand, he gripped a serrated combat knife, the blade trembling not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a cornered animal. He looked at Sable, the invisible nurse in her tattered blood-flecked scrubs, and let out a hollow, jagged laugh. "You're just a nurse," he spat, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "A mistake. A glitch in the system." He lunged, a chaotic burst of violence meant to overwhelm her with raw power. Sable didn't meet his rage with her own. She met it with clinical discipline. As he swung the heavy blade in a wide, desperate arc, she stepped into his guard, her movement as fluid and calculated as a scalpel's path through skin. She didn't flinch at the steel humming past her ear. Instead, she drove the handle of her heavy-duty trauma shears into the nerve cluster of his forearm. The knife clattered to the floor, the sound of metal on tile a sharp punctuation to his sudden gasp of pain. Hollis roared, swinging a blind, heavy fist, but Sable was already gone. She was a ghost in the periphery, moving with a predatory economy that made him look like he was fighting the air itself. She struck with the shears again, not to kill, not yet, but to dismantle. A sharp snip to the tendon of his wrist, a blunt strike to the lateral side of his knee. She was treating him like an anatomical diagram, systematically shutting down his ability to resist. "This isn't a slaughterhouse, John," Sable whispered, her voice a chillingly steady anchor in the red-lit chaos. "It's an operating theater. And you're the specimen." Hollis collapsed to his knees, his strength drained by the surgical precision of her strikes. He looked up, finally seeing the dragon's wife for what she truly was, not a victim, but the architect of his demise. Sable stood over him, the trauma shears held with the white-knuckled grip of an executioner. She didn't feel anger, only the cold, hollow satisfaction of a job nearing completion. With a final, decisive movement, she brought the steel down, not with mercy, but with the absolute finality of a closing shift. The apex predator had been deconstructed, and as the silence returned to the West Wing, only the nurse remained standing. The sirens of the arriving police fleet were a distant, frantic wail against the sudden silence of the West Wing. The emergency strobes finally stabilized, returning the hallway to a steady, clinical white that felt harsher than the darkness. Sable Morrison stood in the center of the corridor, her blue scrubs now a map of shadows and iron-scented stains. She didn't look like a survivor. She looked like the victor of a war no one else was invited to fight. The heavy pneumatic doors at the end of the hall hissed open. It wasn't the police who entered first. A line of men in tailored charcoal suits stepped through, moving with a synchronized, silent discipline that pushed back the chaos of the hospital. At their center was C.O. Muntake. He looked immaculate, a sharp contrast to the carnage surrounding him. His overcoat was buttoned, his eyes like polished flint as they swept over the incapacitated gunman and the shattered equipment. He didn't rush to Sable. He didn't sweep her into a frantic embrace or check her for wounds. He knew his wife better than to treat her like glass. He stopped exactly 6 feet away, his presence commanding the very air in the room. Behind him, Dr. Eris and the surviving interns watched from the shadows of the nurses' station, their breath hitching as they recognized the Iron Dragon of the CO Syndicate. They expected a rescue. They expected a powerful man to claim his fragile wife. Instead, Munteak stopped and looked at the trauma shears still gripped in Sable's hand. He saw the cold, unwavering light in her eyes, the light of the woman he had married, the only person in the world he truly feared and respected. Slowly, with a deliberate and solemn grace, the most feared man in Korea lowered his head. He bent at the waist, performing a deep, silent bow that resonated with absolute, peerless homage. The staff gasped in a collective, terrified realization. The bow wasn't an act of love, it was an acknowledgement of rank. "The ward is secured, husband," Sable said, her voice regaining that melodic, level anchor. "The cleanup crews are behind me," Munteak replied, straightening up, his gaze never leaving hers. "The world will be told a story of a gas leak and a heroic evacuation. Your secret is as safe as it was yesterday." He reached out, his gloved hand briefly brushing the air near her cheek, a ghost of a gesture. He wasn't there to save her, he was there to witness her. He turned to leave, his men following in a silent tide, leaving the staff of Metropolitan Central to stare at the woman they had spent 3 years ignoring. Sable didn't watch him go. She turned back to the nurses' station, her spine as straight as a blade. The dragon had bowed to his queen, and for the first time, the West Wing knew exactly who was in charge. The atmosphere of the West Wing had changed by the time the morning sun began to bleed through the rain-streaked windows. The air no longer smelled of ozone and cordite, but of fresh paint and a new, profound beginning. As the day shift arrived, the dismissive whispers and the casual arrogance that had defined the ward for years vanished, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Whenever Sable Morrison entered a room, the air seemed to settle, the frantic energy of the hospital grounding itself in her presence. Dr. Eris stood at the nurses' station, but he wasn't barking orders or tossing clipboards. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, waiting patiently for Sable to finish her review of the morning transition charts. When she finally looked up, he didn't see an invisible assistant or a timid ghost. He saw a commander. His ego had been replaced by a genuine, startled respect. "The board processed the emergency recommendation within the hour," Eris said, his voice quiet and clear of its usual edge. He slid a small, plastic-wrapped box across the counter. "It's not a medal from the city, but I believe it's the only title that actually matters in this wing." Sable opened the box. Inside was a new name badge, the plastic catch gleaming under the soft morning light. It didn't just carry her name. In bold, clear, uncompromising letters, it read, "Sable Morrison, Charge Nurse." The young intern, who only yesterday had joked about her being an NPC, stood nearby. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He was standing straight, his posture mimicking a soldier awaiting his theater assignments. "That's going to be a lot more paperwork, Sable," he said, the joke landing with a tone of endearment rather than derision. "It means the ward is mine," Sable replied, her voice now a steady, commanding anchor. She clipped the badge to her scrubs, the fabric as crisp as a dress uniform. Through the panoramic window of the trauma center, she saw a single black SUV pull away from the curb. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just a silent acknowledgement from the man who ruled the streets, recognizing the woman who ruled the ward. The war was over, but the mission was eternal. Sable turned back to her team, her dark eyes sharp, focused, and entirely unafraid. "The show is over," she commanded, the weight of her authority settling over the room like a physical hand. "We have lives to save and a floor to run. Let's get to work." The staff moved instantly, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, collective understanding that they were in the presence of a predator who had chosen to be a protector. Sable Morrison was no longer hiding in the shadows. She had simply decided that from now on, the shadows belonged to her. Thanks for watching till the end. Kindly subscribe to our channel and rate this story in the comments section.